Welcome to The Prescription, the Tax Policy Center's weekly webcast on fiscal policy for the COVID-19 economy. This is one of a series of conversations with state, local, and federal government officials, as well as leading economists and other experts. I'm your host, Howard Gleckman, a senior fellow at TPC and editor of our blog, TaxVox. Our guest today is Glenn Hubbard, the Russell L. Carson Professor of Finance and Economics and director of the Jerome A. Chazen Institute for Global Business at Columbia University. Professor Hubbard was a Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Treasury under President George H.W. Bush and Chairman of the White House Council of Economic Advisors for President George W. Bush. Before we begin, our usual bit of housekeeping. We encourage audience members to submit questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. The event's being recorded and will be posted on TPC's website. If you'd like to join the conversation on social media, please use the hashtag #LiveAtUrban. And if you'd like to suggest a future guest for The Prescription, just email us at info@taxpolicycenter.org. Glenn Hubbard, welcome to The Prescription. It's good to see you again.
Thanks, Howard. Likewise.
Last month, you co-authored a Washington Post column with former Federal Reserve Vice Chair Alan Blinder. You're a Republican, Professor Blinder is a Democrat, but you agreed on 3 principles for the next COVID relief plan. First, Congress should act quickly. Second, aid should be targeted to the greatest need, including public health measures to open schools. And it should provide relief for businesses and families hurt most by the pandemic, as well as state and local governments. You also recommended that assistance phase out as the economy improves rather than on a fixed date. Finally, you said you were not very worried that President Biden's $1.9 trillion relief plan is too big. So let's unpack each of these ideas. First, let's talk about speed. Democrats say they want Congress to pass a bill within a month from now. Biden says he'd like the bill to be bipartisan, but he's willing to negotiate with Republicans for only a few weeks. Then he'll move a Democrat-only bill. In this case, does speed take precedence over bipartisanship?
Well, I think speed is very important, but I do think a bipartisan solution is possible. I view this, the column that Alan and I wrote, is a bit like the game show Jeopardy. If you have the answer, what's the question? And so it's not just about size, whether 1.9 trillion is too big or too small, because it could be too big, depending on what you're doing with it. The question is, what problems are you trying to solve? And so to me, speed in terms of assuring states they have public health support and support for essential services, support for the unemployed with triggers that continue as long as the labor market is in the state that it's in, and perhaps additional assistance to businesses. These are things that we need, and I think speed is important. Things like the direct checks, I think Alan and I were much less sympathetic toward and didn't view those as well targeted or particularly in need of speed. As you know, a lot of what is in the agenda from the administration's perspective isn't just related to COVID, it's more structural changes, and those too are debatable as to speed.
In terms of the timing of it, does it make sense to you to set a target of mid-March to get this passed?
I think so. I think so. I think that's an entirely reasonable target. And then the question is, what's the this? You know, to the notion that you can't spend too much, I would say I don't agree with that. That's not really what Alan and I said. We said a large package is in order, but it really depends on the type. And depending on your point of view on the political spectrum, you might be concerned simply because of general fiscal financial issues, but you should also be concerned about compromising a future agenda. If you spend too much now on something, I hate to be the naysayer, but there's always a budget constraint in life. You're simply going to stop yourself down the road. And so I think some care is in order, but mid-March is fine.
Mm-hmm. I want to get back to this question about spending now versus spending later, but let's first get into this question of targeting. As you said, that's very important. And there seems to be broad bipartisan consensus to increase federal funding for vaccines, testing, and PPE for reopening schools and in-person learning. That one seems like everyone is on board with that. But there seems to be deep division, at least in Congress, over state and local aid. Why should the bill include that assistance for subnational governments?
Well, it's a very good question. Many states, obviously states differ in their fiscal situation, but states collectively are still in a hole. It's not as bad as the hole that existed before the last fiscal measure was passed. So last summer, in an Aspen project, Jason Furman and Tim Geithner, Melissa Carney, and I had put out a budget for assistance that had a larger number for states, but some of that has already happened. But I think states still face a hole, perhaps not as large as the administration thinks, but still a hole that needs to be filled. The argument really is twofold. One is how big is that number? And the other is a concern about whether states would use that money to simply paper over other structural problems, pensions, let's say in state budgets. As Alan and I noted, to the extent that the hole is real, we would expect governors to do the right thing and fill their current needs. So I understand the political concern, but I still think we need to get the right amount of aid to states and quickly.
Do you have a number in mind? Biden's proposed over 500 billion. Is that too much? And is there a number that you think works?
Well, I think it is too much now. The Aspen proposal we had last summer came close to 500 billion. It was based on some work that the National Governors Association had done. But I think those numbers have changed both with existing aid and how good revenue numbers have been in some states. So I would think a number that half of that is probably more realistic.
Mm-hmm. So you also suggest phasing out the assistance as the economy improves. Tell me, what metrics would you use? Is it employment? Is it changes in state revenues, overall GDP growth? What's the right measure?
Well, the triggers that we were thinking were really in the labor market for the unemployment rate, because obviously the labor market healing is a critical variable for all of this, and none of us knows exactly the pace at which that will happen. But reassuring people that the aid will be in place as long as labor market conditions are stressed, I think is helpful. So we suggested some triggers in the Aspen paper. For state aid per se, I'm not sure that you necessarily need that, but there are other things you can be doing with triggers for states, for example, Medicaid matching funds and such.
Mm-hmm. So in terms of size, I don't want to try to pin you down an exact dollar amount, but do you have in your head kind of an optimal size of what this next relief plan ought to be?
It's hard to say because it really depends on what you're spending the money on. So for example, if I were to list categories of spending I think the economy needs, they're not all in the scope of this bill. So when I talked to a group of students the other day about this, I said, think about two economists, Keynes and Hayek. So the Keynes story would be, we've got this aggregate demand hole to fill, and that's what largely this bill is talking about. The Hayek story is there's a lot of reallocation that is going to be happening in the economy, and we want to facilitate that reallocation. It's a different set of policies, but it does require fiscal aid. So to be specific, maybe it's block grant support for community colleges. Maybe it's a lot more support for training. That's not typically what people have in mind when they think of stimulus or recovery packages. But if I were using words like build back better, let's say, that's definitely what I would have in mind. So I think part of it depends on whether the number includes that. If the number is the more classic unemployment insurance, aid to states, and so on, I think you could get by with about half of the number that's being suggested.
So something in the neighborhood of $1 trillion is a top
Exactly.
line number, if it were appropriately spent.
Exactly, if it's well targeted in that way.
So I won't quite get off this question of size because this has generated a lot of discussion. Many Republicans, as you noted, and even former Clinton Treasury Secretary Larry Summers worry that this bill is too big. Many Republican lawmakers dislike its effects on deficit and debt and the overall size of government. Summers and economists such as Olivier Blanchard worry that it would set off a new round of inflation. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen, the former Fed chair, and Jay Powell, the current Fed chair, seem unworried about a new relief bill overheating the economy. You seem to side with Yellen and Powell. Tell me why.
Well, I don't see short-term overheating as being the major risk. And I think I agree with what Secretary Yellen said and what Chair Powell has said. They have tools to deal with this. It's unpleasant, to be sure. I'm also cognizant of the political economy problems they'll face, but they definitely know how to do this. I'm more worried about the longer-term fiscal constraints, both in terms of size of debt, but also in terms of scope of what the government can do. A few minutes ago, I just outlined an agenda of things I at least would think would be part of Build Back Better. Those things all cost money, and I'd hate to see them crowded out by giving checks to people who don't need money now. So in that sense, I have sympathy with all of the points of view, but perhaps for different reasons.
those people who are worried about overheating, what indicators would you look for? Would you suggest that people look at to see if maybe we are on the cusp of some more inflation?
Well, certainly depending on what you mean by inflation, we could be monitoring obviously consumer price indicators, but the inflation measure I'm a little more worried about, and I'm more worried about it in the context of monetary policy and fiscal policy, is actually financial stability. In other words, money spilling over into higher and higher risk activities. To me, that is all the more reason to encourage the Fed to be handing the baton to the fisc to carry that. We tried in the Great Recession, and we've tried now to use monetary policy perhaps a little too heavily. This time we've been more aggressive on fiscal policy. And so in that sense, as I sort out the balance of risks, I'm a little bit less worried on the fiscal policy side, as opposed to a case that says, let's just let the Fed take care of it, because I think that does risk financial stability concerns.
Some are actually worried about financial stability now. They look at a very frothy stock market. They look at this increase in junk bond investment, crazy things like GameStop. Are there early signs that bother you that maybe we do have a beginnings of a problem here?
Well, I think we would suspect that if you keep interest rates very low for a very long period of time, you need to watch out for froth. And you've mentioned some examples. Having said that, if I were to do a discounted cash flow analysis of the stock market at current discount rates, though, to be candid, things don't look like a bubble. That doesn't mean that we're not immune to a sudden snap in rates, but I don't necessarily see that coming. So I guess I'm of concern enough that I would suspect that Secretary Yellen will focus on financial stability. She certainly has the bona fides to do that. She'll now be running the Financial Stability Oversight Council. And I would encourage her to think about where there are holes, but I don't see a crisis around the corner.
So this question of interest rates, I think, is an interesting one. And as you know, Summers and Jason Furman have argued we're in a period of secular low interest rates. We should worry, they say, about government debt service, not government debt. And with interest rates so low and no prospects they're going to rise anytime soon, it's acceptable to let debt continue to rise, even though it now exceeds 100% of GDP. Indeed, Summers particularly argues the opportunity cost of not making long-term investments now is high. Do you agree with him? Does he have a point?
Well, I think he has a point, but you have to be careful. So a couple of things. We don't really know how long of a period of time we have of these so-called structural low interest rates. Depending on your view about potential growth in the economy and what you expect from technological change over time, I think it would be naive to think that real interest rates are stuck at the level we've seen in recent years forever. I think that's naive. And I think it would be naive to think that there's no upside risk to inflation. So in terms of nominal interest rates, the risks to me strike me as significantly more on the upside than on the downside. The other point is there's a difference between being something that's being sustainable and something that's being smart. So, could I spend $1,000 on dinner tonight? I probably could, but I don't think it would be a very smart idea for me to do that. And so I still think we're not out of the woods of deciding what's reasonable government spending. So if somebody had a well-defined infrastructure program, building long-lived assets for the economy, whether those are classic infrastructure or broadband, whatever your definition is, that seems to me an easier case than saying, well, let's just start some new social programs and not pay for them just because interest rates are low. I think that would worry me.
So that is another interesting point that Larry makes, and it's a more political point, I guess, than an economic one. He strongly supports a big stimulus plan to follow the relief bill, but he worries that an overstuffed bill now could constrain lawmakers as they consider more spending for infrastructure and other things that he likes. And you sort of implied that as well, that maybe you can't do both. Tell me more about kind of how that would go. Do you agree with his political analysis? I know you're an economist, but
well, I mean, Larry, or I should be talking about politics, but I've seen enough budget discussions over many years to think it is a real concern. And that I would hate to see, I mean, Larry and I may differ about what that desirable other spending is, But whatever your notion of desirability is, I do think there's a constraint by doing too much now. Now, again, if we're doing a lot now because we're maintaining unemployment insurance or making sure people are vaccinated, well, that's just a risk we have to take. But if we're sending checks to people who didn't lose their jobs and their wages didn't go down, that's a little bit of a head scratcher. So I think I share Larry's concern.
Mhm. I want to ask you about unemployment. It's an interesting issue. As you said, that's kind of a classic response. But one thing we've learned in the last year is that state unemployment systems are badly overtaxed. And I wonder, does it make sense to use them as a chassis for getting money to people, or is there some better way to do it?
Well, it's definitely something that we need to focus on. As you know, Washington's not very good at working on a clear day. Normally, you'd like to imagine these problems and solve them when you're not in the middle of a crisis. But we do have large private firms who know how to do this. I mean, after all, they're large private actors who pay large swaths of the economy or move money around to small and mid-sized businesses. They do it for a living. So we should probably be able to harness their technology, what they're doing, to be able to figure out how to do direct payments, or at a minimum, make sure that the systems that states are using don't require knowledge as old as I am about how to be a computer programmer. I learned that my COBOL skills might be highly valued in some states.
I guess the problem is that the Democrats talk about putting money in this bill to fix the system, but by the time the system gets fixed, it's going to be too late for this round of payments.
Well, that's why I would like to see more thinking. So to give you an example, the Paycheck Protection Program, which is a program I had worked on and have written on in my research, that is a program that was designed in part because of constraints that are institutional. In other words, not a program that economists just sitting in a room would say, let's do it this way. It was designed for institutional reasons. So I think I would like to see more thought about, if we needed programs like this in the future, how should they be run? And then let's back up from that and say, what do we need to create now? Is it a business interruption insurance program with a federal element? Is it systems changes? It sounds mundane to many members of Congress, but I think getting that right will make it easier if there's a next time. And one thing we know, whether it's pandemics or other crises, there will be a next time. I can't tell you what it is, but there's always a next time.
Um, One more argument about size. It's a little more technical, but I think it's interesting to explore. And that's whether or not the size of this bill exceeds the output gap, the difference between actual output and potential output. Is that a meaningful measure? When you think about this, do you think about the relationship between the size of a relief bill like this and the output gap?
Well, it is and it isn't, if I can sound like an economist. I mean, let me go back to the Jeopardy example. So if you have an answer, you have to guess the question. So if you thought of this as just a classic aggregate demand stimulus problem, that's what calls to mind output gap comparisons. And if that's what you have in mind, yes, this is big relative to the output gap by any way you measure. If I were talking about a large stimulus bill, though, I think what I would have in mind is a fear of scarring in the labor market, in the reallocation process, and wanting to get out ahead of that and thinking about the kind of spending, going back to my Keynes and Hayek example, that both has a Keynesian element, but also this reallocation element, then it's a different lens. So I think it depends what your argument is. I can't, to be honest, tell what the Biden people mean when they talk about it. They're speaking in purely Keynesian language. And if that's the case, yeah, it's too big.
Mhm. Let me ask you about a couple of specific provisions in the Democrats' bill. The first one is the proposed increase in the minimum wage to $15 an hour by 2025. We've all seen CBO has just estimated it would bring nearly 1 million people out of poverty, but at the same time, it would cost 1.4 million jobs. First of all, do you agree with the estimates? And second, is this a trade-off worth making?
Well, I think the CBO estimates look reasonable to me. As you know, that the studies of the minimum wage have a very wide dispersion, and CBO does what it always does and comes up the middle of what it thinks is the best possible estimates. There are important trade-offs. And if I were to ask myself, what's the problem I'm trying to solve? If the goal is, as President Biden has said, I think on more than one occasion, that no one who works full-time in America should be poor. Seems like a reasonable goal. It doesn't seem like a problem that needs to be solved only with the minimum wage. I would be thinking about the earned income tax credit for single workers, something both sides of the aisle have talked about in the past. And if I were proposing a major increase in the minimum wage, I think I would also simultaneously be talking about large training support so that people who are made redundant as a result of that higher minimum wage have opportunities for something else. So I just think it's part of a solution. I don't think anybody could argue that you shouldn't raise the minimum wage at all. It hasn't gone up in many years. But whether to go all the way to $15 an hour in the middle of a scarred labor market is a right answer, I think is a bit troubling. And I don't think it's only Republicans asking that question. I'm not naive. I'm not knowledgeable enough to know whether this portion is doable by reconciliation. But even if it were, I'm not sure that every Democrat would vote for it.
Mhm. Yeah, I think there's a lot of concern. And as you said, the timing is particularly interesting. I suppose one way to approach this would be to stretch out the
Right, you
length
could
of
do
time
it.
before you get to $15.
But even there, I think I would try to marry the path of the higher minimum wage with more support for education and for training. Because again, going back to the goal, nobody working full time should be poor. That's a worthy goal, but I don't think it's a goal for just the minimum wage.
I should ask you, by the way, have you seen a federal job training program that actually works? We've talked about these for decades, and it's hard to find one that succeeds.
Well, but that's not what I meant by training. So I'll give you two examples. A couple of years ago, Melissa Carney and Austin Goolsbee and I and Amy Gans put out a proposal for a block grant at the federal level to community colleges. They are the real workhorses of individual training. They tend to connect local employers who have mid-skilled jobs with workers. Another is the idea, it's come up many times over the years, of personal reemployment accounts, of funds to longer-term unemployed. So when I say training, I'm not imagining a new federal training program.
The second issue I want to ask you about is related. You mentioned the EITC, but the place that the focus seems to be now is a child tax credit expansion, or a child, even what Senator Romney has proposed, which is something even more ambitious. Just a lot of talk about a guaranteed income, in effect, for families with children. The proposals, Andrew Yang during the presidential campaign, my colleague Len Berman have talked about something like this for all families, not just families with children. What do you make of something like that, a guaranteed income?
Well, I've not been a supporter of UBI as a general proposition, mainly because I think that it's important to support work. And so supporting the earned income tax credit in a broader form with a more generous support for childless workers with a longer phase out range to smooth out marginal tax rate problems in it, that seems to me to be more important. And I say that not just because I like work, though I do. It's an issue about culture and dignity. I don't think anyone in society wants to feel that he or she is not useful. I'm not somebody who believes that there are large numbers of people who just don't want to work. I just don't feel that way. There's obviously some people out there, but not many. And so I think supporting work ought to be our goal. I think what Senator Romney and others may be trying to accomplish is a different and also worthy goal. We don't want children in poverty. That's an important goal. But I think we ought to separate that goal from the notion of rewarding work. So that's why I go back to the question of what's the question you're really trying to answer?
Mhm. And it sounds in this case actually trying to solve two. You want to reward work in some way, but Romney and others also want to support children, get children out of poverty. So is there a way one could do both?
Well, you can. It's just a question of the amount of money you're going to spend. The EITC expansions that do what I said, I'm going from memory, but probably would cost on the order of 20 to $30 billion a year. I'm not sure exactly the cost for Senator Romney's proposal. But while these numbers are large, life is about trade-offs. And I think if we do make those trade-offs, we can do these things.
Let me change gears and ask you about something else, which is international tax. You've written a lot about it, written a book about it, and it's an issue that's increasingly vexing revenue authorities around the world. President Biden's proposed raising tax rates on U.S. corporations and expanding minimum taxes on U.S.-based multinationals, but also creating a Made in America tax credit. Secretary Yellen says the administration will re-engage in multilateral talks with the OECD on digital taxes. Our most recent guest on the prescription, Alan Auerbach, proposes a destination-based tax. From your perspective, what's the best way to approach this?
Well, I would start with Alan's proposal. I mean, the destination-based cash flow tax solves not every, but most of the big problems that have been vexing tax authorities. Indeed, when work started in the debate leading up to the 2017 Tax Act, there had been discussion at the Ways and Means level of that kind of a tax. It went away because of concerns about border adjustments and things like that. But I do think that is the place to start. I think you should be very careful about sort of pro-America tax policy, the buy America, build in America kinds of things. We want American business to be efficient. We don't want a tax system that biases our companies to leave, for sure, but nor do we want a tax system, I think, that overly encourages positions in the United States. The value of most companies that people know about and care about is really in intangibles and ideas, not in the location of factories. And so I think put that way, it's both an interesting problem for our Treasury, but also in terms of international tax coordination, because where you put profits in such an enterprise becomes a little more elastic a decision than it does in a company that makes things and ships them and sells them, sort of the image people have of what a business is. That's not really where most profits get made.
So you say you like a destination-based tax, and of course, one venue for the argument about this is the OECD over this digital tax. Where do you think they can come down on this? Is there a reasonable design for a multinational digital tax, so you don't have countries all going their own way on this?
I think we have to figure that out, because otherwise we will have, I think if we step back, if companies are naive enough to think that the status quo is the default, I don't think that's right. The default is going to be every revenue authority is trying to grab. And so the question is, can there be a system so that companies have more certainty in planning? One of the reasons I'm attracted to cash flow type taxes, Allen's or other variants, is that they do have a heavy element of falling on rents. And I think we have some companies whose earnings have a large inframarginal component, and we're not taxing those very heavily, yet we're taxing quite heavily companies who have closer to a normal return on capital. So I think if we could work this out in technology companies, we'd be to the better. And I think Janet Yellen is actually an excellent person for leading that conversation.
So it sounds like what you're suggesting is the politics of this has changed a little bit, that perhaps these firms have come to understand they would be better off with a uniform system rather than sort of fighting any reform and ending up with this multiplicity of taxes.
I'm not sure. That depends on what they think the default is. If they think the default is we'll just keep it the way it is, then I'm sure they will fight. But if they think the default is a very expensive patchwork quilt of double taxation, then that's a different outcome. So I think this is both an interesting question for economists, but also for practitioners.
We have just a minute left. I want to ask you about another issue you've written a lot about, which is a carbon tax. You've been a very strong advocate of a carbon tax. President Biden has talked a lot about making climate change a major priority of his campaign. In just a minute or two, can you give talk to us about why a carbon tax would be a better way to approach this than a regulatory regime?
Well, I think a regulatory regime, in general, any command and control system is going to generate much more inefficiency than the carbon tax. To me, a carbon tax is easier for a number of reasons than a cap and trade system, although in principle, they could be symmetric. The carbon tax would also generate revenue that could be used either to reduce deficit spending or for other priorities the administration might have. and would send clear price signals for business people to innovate. I understand the politics of why President Biden might not be there, but to me, we will get to a carbon tax discussion. We'll either get to it out of environmental policy or we'll get to it out of the budget, but we'll get to it.
We are out of time. Glenn Hubbard, it's always good to talk to you.
Likewise.
Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
And thanks to the audience.